U.S. military budget from spending cuts.
As we end our combat mission in Afghanistan, this will be the first budget to fully reflect the transition DoD is making for after 13 years of war.
To a spending spree. The winners, missiles like the Tomahawk from Raytheon. Their stocks, a 5-year surge. Why not focus on the economy?
55% of U.S. discretionary spending is spent on the Pentagon and the war machine. Bring those tax dollars home and let's invest in our communities.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of Economic Divide, U.S. War Profiteers. In this segment, we're going to take a look at the Wall Street profits, why the turnaround in defense spending, and the civilian applications from war technologies. Also look at the top toys that the U.S. military produces with U.S. taxpayer dollars to justify its use for the war economy. It's a striking ad. An intimidating combat aircraft soars in the background with the slogan up front in all capital letters, 300 million protected, 95,000 employed. The ad for Lockheed Martin's F-22 Raptor fighter plane. Yes, when the economy is doing poorly, like the U.S. economy, despite claims of a recovery, the wheels of the war machine needs to keep turning through the continuing war and influence of the military-industrial complex on the government, with American tax dollars funding their production. America's biggest jobs program and employer, the U.S. military. As a matter of fact, it is also the largest employer in the world. If the U.S. did not have the military to employ millions of Americans, the U.S. unemployment rate would be over 20%. So how many people are employed by the U.S. military, or Defense Department, as they would like to call it? The Defense Department. Here's the headquarters, the Pentagon. $683.7 billion pays for over 3.1 million employees, both military and civilian. Another 3 million people are employed by the defense industry, both directly, making things like weapons, and indirectly, such as working in local businesses, supported by a contractor's location in a town. To get an idea of the economic impact of the U.S. military personnel on the towns that they reside in, here's a look at the 5 largest U.S. military bases, which happen to be in the United States.
My town, Vacaville, California, we, in taxes, according to the National Priorities Project, our tax dollars are $116 million a year go to this war economy. If my town of Vacaville could keep that $116 million and use it for renewable forms of energy, public transportation, education, health care, hiring more teachers, librarians, healthcare workers, that would eliminate poverty in my town. And if we can use the trillions of dollars that are spent on war, black ops, empire, war profiteers, military hardware, if we could eliminate that in the United States, we would eliminate poverty, we would eliminate need, we would eliminate want.
We're better off taking that money and do what FDR did back in the 30s when we were, on the verge of a depression, and basically, let's do a new deal. Let's do a new deal. Billions of dollars into roads, bridges, water and sewer lines in cities all across this country are falling apart. Put people to work. I mean, the whole idea is to put people to work, and you're going to create far more jobs if you do a domestic stimulus such as this than you're ever going to create by making war and by buying these ridiculously priced arms from Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman.
It's these big money and job figures that make lawmakers fight for defense contracts in their districts and why defense contractors lobby for these contracts. And it's not surprising that the budget has shot up to $683.7 billion. Breakdown of the DoD. Beneath the Department of Defense are the big ones: the U.S. Department of the Army, the U.S. Department of the Navy, and the U.S. Department of the Air Force. Which leads us to an example of the budgets for the fiscal year 2010, not including the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Here's a look at the total military spending table, with a grand total of $692.7 billion in spending. When it comes to the budgets of the major departments, as you can see, the Army towers over the rest at $244.9 billion. The map of the Department of Defense geographic commands. And here's the Unified Combatant Command, a sprawling web of U.S. military command, which has a broad and continuing mission around the world, including both active and covert operations.
When you look at the Pentagon's website and their public information, they acknowledge having somewhere over 700 military bases scattered among about 130 countries. That's astonishing. That's astonishing. Most Americans have no idea. There are more than 250,000, more than 250,000 U.S. troops stationed on these bases all around the world.
We're saying bring our tax dollars home. 55% of U.S. discretionary spending is spent on the Pentagon and the war machine. Bring those tax dollars home and let's invest in our communities. And so it's obvious that the war machine pulling the strings of Democrats and Republicans alike.
U.S. arms sales to the Middle East. During the years 2009 through 2013, 22% of arms transfers to the Middle East went to the UAE, 20% to Saudi Arabia, and 15% to Turkey. The U.S. accounted for 42% of total arms supplies to the Middle East. Largest ever U.S. arms sale was to Saudi Arabia, 84 Boeing F-15 fighter jets and more than 100 attack helicopters, 70 upgrades of existing Saudi F-15s, and 36 AH-6M Little Birds, lightweight helicopters.
The Middle East, of course, is a region where the U.S. has been actively arming, training. The CIA trains the so-called terrorists of what was Al-Qaeda or ISIS or wherever, and then arms them, and then they, of course, those become tools to oppress the people that live in those countries also.
U.S. arms sales to Israel. Israel, the largest recipient of U.S. military aid, $3 billion annually, 25% of Israel's military budget. Total U.S. assistance to date, $121 billion. As for the type of military sales to Israel that are granted, they run the gamut, like over $1 billion sale of 6 V-22 Osprey from Boeing and thousands of bunker-busting bombs. And finally, U.S. military spending compared to the rest of the world. China, Russia, and the UK took the top 3 positions, combined with the rest of the countries, to equal $695 billion in total sales, while the U.S. tops that figure, coming in at $711 billion. The U.S., responsible for 39% of the world total, distantly followed by China at 9.5%, Russia 5.2%, the UK 3.5%, and Japan at 3.4% of the total world sales. So has the world become a safer place?
The world has become less peaceful this year. Levels of global peace have fallen by 5% since 2008, and the nature of global conflict is shifting. The 2013 Global Peace Index shows that while there's been a decline in hostility between states, the number and intensity of internal conflicts is increasing. The Global Peace Index shows that in 2012, violence cost $9.46 trillion US.
Led by Lockheed Martin Corporation, the biggest U.S. defense companies are trading at record prices as shareholders reap rewards from escalating military conflicts around the world. Investors see rising sales from makers of missiles, drones, and other weapons as the U.S. hits Islamic State fighters in Syria and in Iraq. Meanwhile, the The U.S. defense contractors are making money by supplying both sides of the conflict. Corporate profits. Investors are seeing a rise in sales for missiles, drones, and other weapons. There has been a metamorphosis. Al-Qaeda, recreated in the form of the ISIL, and U.S. arms manufacturers smiling again as the United States hits ISIL targets in Syria and in Iraq. Bloomberg said Syria to Ukraine wars sent U.S. defense stocks to records. The biggest U.S. defense companies are trading at record prices as shareholders reap rewards from escalating military conflicts around the world.
Well, basically, we're in a period right now of deflation. The Fed knows that. That's why we have zero interest rates. And so that's why you're seeing, the U.S. has always intervened in foreign countries, but in the last year, you've seen a sort of a hyperdrive where we intervene in Libya, we intervene in Ukraine, we intervene in Iraq now with ISIS, which we trained and now we want to destroy. And so it's this desperate attempt by these bankers to stave off deflation by reflating the global economy through wars.
If you're talking to those in charge, the small percentage of people in charge, and they're not looking any further than the next fiscal quarter, then this type of economy almost makes sense. But like all forms of industry within our culture, it's not sustainable. And if you look even just a little bit past the next fiscal quarter, you would realize that the way we are choosing to live and the way we are running our economy is driving us towards social, economic, and even worse, environmental collapse. So it really is, if you maintain a short-term perspective, you can make an argument like the one you just articulated. But what we need is a long-term perspective to see a bigger picture, to recognize that, like most forms of practices within a capitalist economy, it's not sustainable.
Just days after the strikes in Syria began on September 23, shares of Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and General Dynamics all reached record prices. Their focus, equipment rather than soldiers. Jack Ablin, CEO of BMO Private Bank, who overlooks $66 billion, including Northrop Grumman Core and Boeing Company shares, said, "There's a sense that demand for military equipment and weaponry will likely rise to the extent that we can shift away from relying on troops and rely more heavily on equipment. That could present an opportunity." That's dollar signs for investors who see rising sales from makers of missiles, drones, and other weapons.
Dominate anything else.
The missiles are by far the surefire winners. Here are some examples and the manufacturers behind them. Tomahawk cruise missiles and laser-guided bombs. Manufacturer, Raytheon. Hellfire missile. Manufacturer, Lockheed Martin. GBU-44 Viper Strike. Manufacturer, Northrop Grumman. MB-52 bombs and F-16. Manufacturer, General Dynamics. Here's the stock performance of these manufacturers, which includes the 5-year trends on October 6, 2014.
First of all, it really doesn't benefit the U.S. economy per se. I mean, it benefits the oligarchs, it benefits the CEOs and the stockholders, the defense contractors of the oil companies, of the reconstruction experts such as Halliburton, Bechtel, Fluor Daniel, because, of course, if you destroy a country, you have to rebuild it, and there's a lot of contracts in that, too.
The stock of Lockheed Martin reached an all-time high of $180.74 on September 19. Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and General Dynamics also set records. That quartet and Boeing accounted for about $105 billion in federal contract orders last year. And this table outlines the average median in contracts awarded to these manufacturers. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing towered over the rest, with average yearly government contracts well over $20 billion. But just a short time ago, things looked different, very different.
And a Fox News alert, Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel is expected to recommend some deep budget cuts to our armed forces.
The Secretary of Defense essentially saying it is time to move away from the era of big ground wars like Afghanistan, time to cut the U.S. military into a lean, mean team ready for 21st century war.
I'm encouraged by the budget deal that Congress has passed. It's a step in the right direction. It's a step in the right direction for us. But even with this agreement, this budget agreement, DOD still faces very difficult budget decisions. As we end our combat mission in Afghanistan, this will be the first budget to fully reflect the transition DOD is making for after 13 years of war, the longest conflict in our nation's history.
Here we are, November 2014. Not only is the U.S. selling equipment and munitions against the ISIL, 60 countries have additionally volunteered to participate, many to purchase their military equipment from, you guessed it, the United States.
The only language understood by killers like this is the language of force. So the United States of America will work with a broad coalition to dismantle this network of death. And already over 40 nations have offered to join this coalition.
The irony is that ISIS is using U.S.-made ammunition and weapons, which means U.S. weapons companies get to supply all sides of the new endless war. Can you blame investors for being so giddy?
I think the biggest problem, or where I disagree with the president most strenuously, is in arming the Syrian rebels. The Syrian rebels don't seem to be able to hang on to the arms. Most of the arms we've given, and the Saudis have given, and the Qataris, have wound up in the hands of ISIS. So I said a year ago that the irony they will have trouble overcoming is that we will someday be fighting the weapons that we sent into the Middle East, and I think that irony is now.
The purpose of the war on terror. It was designed from the start to be endless. Do you have any idea how many different styles of military jets, airplanes, and vehicles the U.S. produces? 30? Did you say 40? Not even close. How about 134? From helicopters to UAVs for the Marine Corps and Navy. And when it comes to bombs, forget it. In order for you to get a taste of the most expensive U.S. military jets, equipments, and bombs, here's a list of the top 5 of the ones that are active. Coming in at number 5, the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye. Price per unit, $232 million. Manufacturer, Northrop Grumman. Operating income, $3.123 billion. At number 4, the P-8A Poseidon. Price per unit, $290 million. Manufacturer, Boeing. Operating income, $6.562 billion. At number 3, the C-17A Globemaster III. Price per unit, $328 million. Manufacturer, Boeing. Operating income, $6.562 billion. At number 2, the F-22 Raptor. Price per unit, $350 million. Manufacturer, Lockheed Martin. Operating income, $4.505 billion. And coming in at number 1, the B-2 Spirit. Price per unit, $737 million. Manufacturer, Northrop Grumman, with an operating income of $3.123 billion.
We spend billions of dollars on this F-35, to Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, all the same familiar defense contractors, many of whose shareholders are not U.S. citizens. For example, Lockheed Martin, most of the shareholders are actually British. They do things at Area 51, they do things in the Nevada desert that the United States citizens don't even know goes on. I'm not even sure the government knows what's going on at these places.
The only thing the U.S. Actually manufactures anymore are these tools of death and also type 2 diabetes through our diet. But anyway, that's kind of a little bit off the subject. But we could take those factories that build these tools of death and destruction, and we could actually use them to build positive things, more trains, more buses that run on clean fuel, and solar panels, wind turbines. There's so many positive things that we can use that industry for. We wouldn't lose jobs if we retooled or transformed the death industry into something positive. As a matter of fact, I think that we would generate jobs and that we could have almost no unemployment here in the United States if we forced the war machine to be a peace machine.
Are you ready for the counter-arguments? Some say this permanent war doctrine provides spin-off benefits for civilian technologies. Technology transfer from military to civilian use is nothing new and vital to the U.S. economy. From death, blood, and gore, technology rises from the ashes. This ad by Lockheed Martin shows how they make up for the killing machine that they are on the battlefield by their display of civilian use from war technology.
Technology that enables cars to drive themselves. But at Lockheed Martin, we're at the forefront of the science that makes them real.
That's the softer side of perhaps the most famous U.S. military manufacturer. Let's not forget that Lockheed Martin also produces bombs and drones that does this. Technology transfer from military to civilian use is nothing new. It's more important to the U.S. economy than you can imagine. The ultimate hope? Organizations like the Army Research Laboratory can issue licenses to private partners who can then take the financial risk to spin off the technology to civilian markets. The research labs will then receive royalties and the research can continue. From wars which cause incalculable suffering and loss of human life comes transformational technologies that spin off to civilian use. How much is the technology contribution from the military to the civilian world? 50% is driven by innovative industries, and 75% addresses needs of the military. During the time that this program was aired, a number of Tomahawk missiles have been dropped on Iraq and on Syria. Each costs $1 million. Some destroy ISIL pickup trucks. Cost of the truck, a mere $30,000. The truck provided by the U.S. government. The U.S. is supplying both sides of the war. Double the quantity means double the profits. Meanwhile, double the death and destruction. That does it for another program. Please send us your comments to the email address below. I'm Kobe Tafwai, and I'll see you next week.